This is an RNZ podcast.
24 minutes to 10 here on RNZ National, and the Quizmaster is in trouble. Oh, good grief. Alan in Wellington quite rightly pointing out that Raffles, the gentleman thief, is in fact not a nemesis of Sherlock Holmes. He is a character who is based on Sherlock Holmes, but is sort of a gentleman thief version of Holmes. Now, he did play cricket, so the answer to the question remains the same. We don't have to do a repeat of the quiz. To Olive's relief, I should say. But quite rightly, the Quizmaster has been, the premise of the Quizmaster's question has been questioned, and Alan in Wellington is quite right. So the Quizmaster will, I can assure you, be disciplined. I got in there ahead of Colin Peacock, who is here now with the Midweek Mediawatch. Hello, Colin.
Hi there, Emil. That's disappointing. I mean, you read the quiz out, that's on you, isn't it? You should be the last line of factual
Well,
defense.
that's how it works, right?
Not try and blame shift onto other people who do your work for you.
You're entirely right. I bear responsibility for anything that's on the quiz, and this is how it would work. If a BSA complaint were to be made saying that the question is wrong and Emil Donovan should apologise for it, then I bear responsibility for that incorrect information.
Disappointed with you already because I heard the opening of your show and said I was wet in Auckland, I had to carry an umbrella. Like, we just had a year 11 age kid run under 4 minute mile in the same weather in Auckland.
Oh, it hadn't happened by the time I read out that.
Don't care, same weather. He's toughing it out, breaking records. You're whining about getting a bit, and you had an umbrella. It wasn't like you'd left it at home.
Isn't that amazing though?
Get the quiz right, toughen up about the weather. I'm fine anyway. How are you? Thanks for having me on. Lovely to be here.
It's lovely to have you here. I know you're a bit of an athlete, Cole. Isn't that amazing that that sub 4 minute mile by a 15-year-old?
I don't know. I mean, that record was broken back in the 1930s or something. You know,
by a 24-year-old medical student.
Yeah.
You know, the age thing is the notable thing here, isn't it?
I don't know. 3 minutes 59, 4 minutes 4. I don't care. Just running around.
You know this is live, right?
Yeah. I heard.
All right, let's talk some media. And we'll start with ownership of media companies, shall we? So last week on Midweek Mediawatch, Hayden Donnell and I spoke about the billionaire seeking to change the board at NZME. He was pushing back at claims that he wanted radical editorial changes at the Herald and Newstalk ZB, which NZME owns. But it wasn't known if he had support to take control, and there have been developments, Colin.
Yes, there has been. Basically, he has to wait till the end of April, when the next shareholder meeting is at NZME, to push this bid for control. But it turns out the biggest shareholder company called Spheria, or a fund over in Australia, holding, I think, 19% odd of NZME, which has pretty diverse shareholding. So that's a very big stake, reportedly backs Grennan's bid. So it's possible that if he doesn't already have 50%, an electoral majority, Jim James Grennan, the man who wants to roll the board, he might be there, but we can't be sure. Another shareholder, one in the US called Osmium, has actually nominated 2 alternative choices as directors. So that's clearly an alternative play, not on board with the Grennan thing. But this week, the interesting thing also has been that the existing boards kind of struck back. Barbara Chapman is the chairperson of NZME. She told the Herald that she and the directors have met Mr. Grennan. They've also gone to Sydney to talk to shareholders, including, we believe, the Spheria company. And she is saying, look, we're open to having new board members, but the editorial independence is crucial. Radical disruption is not the answer, is a quote she gave to the Herald. She says this is a defining moment for NZME, its future, and New Zealand. So she's saying it's a big deal, and she's saying the future of the company would be undermined by a major change of directors and direction. So fighting back. And they're basically saying what has been out in the public domain about the performance of the company is wrong.
Is wrong. Wrong in what way?
Well, she's saying that Spheria are now saying, or had said last week, which prompted her to speak out, I think that the status quo of the company could not be maintained. It couldn't be sustainable. Talked about net profit dropping 50% in a year. But Chapman is saying, look, that's not what you've said in the past. It's Spheria. I'm not sure why. She said, we are dealing with facts. So that's quite a strong pushback. And she says, look, I'm paraphrasing now, but what this board has done is stabilise. The company had big debt when this board came on. And she says we have outperformed comparable Australasian media companies in the past 5 years. So difficult industry, they've taken difficult choices, a lot of redundancies as we know and reported on a lot, but she says they've stabilised it and they've been successful in converting people into digital subscribers, which is a key thing. So she's saying we're doing a good job in tight times and that this bid to take control is extremely disruptive and threatens the company.
There was another interesting development on Tuesday that the Jim Grennan bid is under consideration by the government's takeovers panel.
Yeah, this is really interesting. So as I think Hayden was saying to you last week that I listen when I'm not on, that Jim Grennan had said, it carefully worded the statement that then the company then had to interpret and tell the NZX, the stock exchange, about to avoid crossing this line of making it a takeover. This is about changing the direction of the company through directors, appointing new directors to change the company that way. So you can't just go around making approaches to people to take control without letting people know that that's what's going on. But the Australian newspaper, which seems to be making the running on this story, and its former New Zealand reporter Bridget Carter, she reported, I think on Monday, Data Room understands the takeovers panel is now investigating whether shareholders calling for change are working in concert. This is a quote from her story in the paper Across the Ditch. Any coordination triggers mandatory takeover obligations. And then local media here followed up, and the takeovers panel would only say the matter was under consideration. So I guess, watch this space along with the other spaces that have to be watched as this really heats up.
Well, that's interesting phrasing. The shareholders calling for change are working in concert. When does working in concert become collusion?
Yes, I'm no commercial or takeover lawyer or specialist, but from what the pundits have been saying in the reports about this, several shareholders agreeing to exercise their votes in a certain way, like in this case, whether they back a change of board members and specifically James Grennan's proposal, that in itself doesn't breach any rules. But the parties would need to be deemed to have broken the rules to be associated parties with close personal or business relationships. So the takeovers panel would have to examine whether there were ongoing arrangements between NZME shareholders or close personal relationships, and whether there were what they call control agreements in the background. That would be the test.
I mean, this all seems very ambiguous and nebulous, that language, associated parties with close personal or business relationships. How would we even know if such relationships existed?
Yeah, that is a tricky one. And some of the pundits quoted in the stories, for example, the reporting of Business Desk, I think I lean fairly heavily on what I just told you, and I'd probably cite them. And Rebecca Stevenson writing about that was quoting people saying, look, from what we've read, from what's out in the public, doesn't sound like it is anything that would concern the takeovers panel wouldn't breach the rules. But some interesting stuff's happened. So one pro-Grennan shareholder is Troy Bowker, who's appeared in other stories. He was controversies about the hurricanes and the sacking of Stuart Nash and so on. He's got a fund called Can Iwi as part of it. He said on social media, Barbara Chapman, the current chair, would have no future if Grennan's board changes go through next month, because the proposal is that one board member would be retained. So that's clearly wargaming and thinking through what they want, quite specific. But some fascinating social media from the Free Speech Union this week in Monday and Tuesday. So they were saying, we are leading the fight to retake our institutions. It starts one board at a time. That's exactly what we're doing. That was one tweet. And then when someone inquired about this and pushed back at them, they said, we think doing this to preserve the voice of all Kiwis is something to brag about. We are just getting started, mate, which is kind of aggressive. They say democracies flourish when our institutions are strong, but they have been co-opted by would-be censors intent on excluding all dissenting views. We're not going to sit by and follow that anymore. And then a post on Facebook that said, for years we've pressured the NZME board to stop picking and choosing who gets access to their platform, to allow legal advertising and to let Kiwis make up their own minds. Last year we contacted a series of wealthy supporters, encouraging them to step up and work to ensure a more functional fourth estate. NZME board members, this is the Free Speech Union here, will now have to face the music for the role they've played in tilting the playing field on numerous important debates, and not a moment too soon. So they're certainly active. And on the Governing Council of the Free Speech Union is Jordan Williams, who's also chief at the Taxpayers Union. He said on Twitter, or X as it is now, that he and other shareholders were, in his words, pissed off that the NZME board had spent money going to Sydney to talk to the shareholders to see what they wanted. And he singled out Barbara Chapman, the chair, about the matter of the Herald declining campaign advertising in the past. He said she's burning through her reputation. So this anti-censorship free speech cause is clearly a motivating factor. Whether that has anything to do, there's a connection between those active interests and the Jim Grennan bid, we don't know, but there is clearly a kind of alliance of some sort, or an alliance of views at least, about this free speech and censorship, which is what NZME and its board is up against.
I mean, they are fans of what you describe as robust, what some might describe as hyperbolic rhetoric, the Free Speech Union. I imagine that reference there to allow legal advertising and let Kiwis make up their own minds, is that a throwback to the Hobson's Pledge ad in the Herald? Was that last year that controversy happened?
Yes, and it's very likely that it's that. Also other campaign groups, the Co-Covenants campaign. I can't recall off the top of my head whether some of those adverts were rejected by NZME specifically, but they had trouble getting their messages across. I know that the Family First group had messages on gender identity and issues like that. I think Allied Press, the Dunedin-based publisher, did publish them, but others turned them down. And this was, I think, remarked upon by the Free Speech Union and others in the the group at the heart of it to be an unnecessary restraint on their freedom to get their message out. So all that stuff's in the background.
I mean, and speaking of the background, bobbing in the background is this idea, it seems, or this perception at least, that new directors would influence editorial change. But is that the case? Can new directors influence editorial change if that's what they want to do without overriding the independence of the company's management and stuff, the journalists in place there? Yeah,
that's right. I mean, directly, no, they shouldn't, technically. But I mean, over time, you can then appoint a CEO you think might be friendly and in line with your views on that, and if you make it a commercial issue about the orientation, the audience you're after, and broadening the appeal of the company for commercial reasons, that sort of stuff can come into play. I mean, James Grennan has said editorial matters are a side issue, but he himself has made it clear that they want to, in his words, improve journalism. You spoke about this last week, less selling of writers' opinions, appealing to a wider political spectrum. So it's clearly not a non-issue for him, and it's not clear. In fact, Shane Curry, the media insider at the Herald, their former editor-in-chief, he said, look, there is a letter that outlines some of these concerns that has not been made public either by him or by the NZME board. And he said in the Herald, I expect that must be released at some stage ahead of that shareholders meeting at the end of April. In that, we'll get a real sense of the editorial endeavour Mr. Grennan is talking about here. So you'd think in time, if he's right there, it must come out. And Shane Curry, interestingly, was on the executive at NZME, and he appeared this week to talk about that on the Herald's daily podcast, The Front Page.
At no stage did the board or the executive give direction in terms of you must cover this story kind of thing. We're a board and an executive. They will make sure the settings are right in terms of resourcing and support. I worked very closely, for instance, on our extensive code of conduct and ethics, presented that to the board for approval. So it's really the settings and the environment that the board and the executive are responsible for to allow that editorial independence to be maintained.
Yeah, so he's talking in the past tense there about how things were under the existing board when he was on the executive. So a very careful choice. But he's saying that's kind of how things are supposed to function, with the management being able to do what they need to do independently, but the board governing the direction and the best interests of the company overall. But yeah, that would clearly change if the board membership changed. But yeah, tough position for Shane Curry as well, right? Because he's
exactly
talking about people who might end up, being, in charge of the company's direction, if not directly determining how the management and the staff work day to day.
It is a fascinating column that he writes. He does have really interesting knowledge of these sorts of things. Speaking of ownership of media companies, Colin, Stuff's ownership, much simpler. Sinead Boucher, the CEO and owner, owns the entire thing after buying it for $1 5 years ago. I think there might, up until recently, have only been one share, but that's gotten more complicated.
Yeah, so last December the company divided itself into two. There's Stuff Digital, which is the Stuff website, and it's Neighbourly, it's audio and video stuff, then the newspaper brands, the Post, Press, Waikato Times and others, into Stuff Limited. So they said at the time this is a conscious uncoupling, they called it, to give both businesses their own focus. But we believed, yes, Sinead Boucher, having bought it for $1 5 years ago, owned a whole lot in a single share. But turns out Companies Office on the 7th of February, they lodged a change, which is 1 million shares for the Stuff Digital part of it. So she is now the owner of 1 million shares rather than just one.
And what might the motivate? Does that make it easier to sell?
Possibly, or technically to float on the stock exchange, or float
right.
part of it to break it up for another investor to come in, or something like that. But the official line from Stuff is the change in the number of shares a month ago was simply an internal transaction to finalise. Are you taking notes here? To finalise the reorganisation of the business we began last year, the separation of the two businesses. So they're saying nothing to it, just admin. But yeah, you'd have to think there'd be a reason for turning one share into 1 million that would be a lot easier to divide up if that's what they really want to do in time, or at least give themselves the option of doing it.
Certainly one that's worth keeping an eye on. Right. 8.5 to 10 is the time here on RNZ National. Colin Peacock in for Midweek Mediawatch. I have been getting texts, and I know a lot of other programs as well have been getting texts from listeners, Colin, who are sick of hearing about school lunches.
We heard a few just before we came
Yeah,
on,
this has
didn't
been
we?
sort of a common refrain. Let me read you a couple that have come in actually just after I mentioned that. Someone writes, I think the school lunch program has been overcooked by the media. Peter, I'll lightly edit this one. Well, actually, no, I'll just read it to you. It's only RNZ who've been continuing the school lunch issue, Peter says, especially leading with other stations only mention it occasionally. Your news team are left-wing supporters. Treasury reported late last year it hasn't increased attendance and it had no effect on Māori students, so it's been a failure. Jude in Christchurch writes, please keep doing stories on school lunches. It's important that we have healthy lunches for our children and so on and so forth. What do you, because decisions on what leads programs and makes front pages are interesting decisions with a lot of thought put into them, it's fair to say.
Yeah, and of course this has the energy of the Parliamentary Press Gallery behind it, because there's a very senior minister and politician involved, and a very high-profile one in the media, which is David Seymour. But I would say programs like Checkpoint have been really dogged, day after day, reporting on these individual failings and trying to get people to be interviewed who are clearly reluctant. But look, I think it's good that the media have followed through. They were all there at the big special media day where the specially prepared samples were handed out and they were assured of how nutritious it was going to be. There's a lot of PR guff on the School Lunch Collective website and even the company that's gone into liquidation, Labelle, about how conscientiously they were doing all this. The public should know if the savings are worth it and what the kids are actually getting or not. They wouldn't know if the media didn't show that. And also because, look, politically, this is a policy that's been left in charge of a leader who opposed it in principle and on the grounds of cost. And finally, I would say the other reason that's now developing and was, headlining the news today, earlier in the day at RNZ, is companies are going bust over this. Jobs are being lost, like Labelle going into liquidation, and smaller companies involved with the older program owing money to the IRD. I think more than 500 jobs at Labelle alone, and it kind of means the Compass company might become the only game in town in this at scale. So I understand that people are getting sick of this kind of daily tally of failures, and like I'm hearing Lisa Owen badgering the School Lunch Collective boss. What did you have for lunch today? You had a salad. What about the day before? And some of that will sound like hectoring and the media going overboard. But no, I think in the end, while they're focusing on some of the negative and isolated cases, we have to know about the architecture of this, and it's an important issue.
I mean, the ACT Party and David Seymour have claimed the media are running a narrative against them.
Yeah.
What do you make of that claim?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, because David Seymour was saying that he had, on ZB, Mike Hosking was claiming that the media were running a narrative, ignoring students and principals who were saying, look, the lunches are fine. But he actually himself also nailed the School Lunch Collective boss by saying, look, did you just see the dollar signs on the contract and say, yeah, we can do that for $3, and now it turns out you can't? And I mean, they're still saying that they can do this, but as we know, Labelle, clearly wasn't able to, and their scaling up so quickly was what might have put them over the line and into liquidation. So probably the best comment I've read about this, which kind of tunes into this thing of whether the scrutiny is over the top or not, was the Herald's Thomas Coughlin. This is a piece yesterday saying, how can we fix this, or should we bother? And he's saying that this is classic New Zealand policy making. Labour sees a social need, creates an expensive policy funded by debt to fund it. Government changes, there's a reaction. They try and ACT comes in, tries to get rid of the policy, tries to cut the cost. And he also makes this excellent point where people say the taxpayers shouldn't be funding this program if they don't think that the cost is worth it. Thomas says, look, we're in debt. We're in a deficit at the moment. It's actually the students themselves who are paying the bill for this in the future when they grow up. So he says a likely solution will involve more cost cutting, most probably, and there will be more efforts to work out whether these lunches can be made satisfactory and healthy enough. But in the end, it's an intergenerational thing, and it could be future generations getting the raw deal, while, as he points out, the cost of super is going up every year, and that is a guaranteed benefit.
Finally tonight, Colin, let's talk a bit about podcasts, shall we? Which pundits say were very influential in the US election, and still their influence grows, it seems.
Indeed. So fascinating. The California Governor, Gavin Newsom, who many thought should have stood for the Democrats instead of Kamala Harris and might have given Trump a run for his money or won the presidency, he's been quiet, but then suddenly popped up with an iHeart podcast going straight to near the top of the charts in the US and worldwide. He has decided you can't beat these conservative influences, you might as well join them. And he's had a range of right-wing influences. Charlie Kirk was his first guest. And this week, Steve Bannon, the chief MAGA man, saying all sorts of things about, and they talked for almost an hour, and the pushback from Newsom was so mild. Have a listen to this.
We hate crony capitalism and corporate welfare.
Except for oil and gas, apparently, Steve. Come on, $3 billion right there.
You've got to generate lower energy costs.
There are exceptions apparently to the rule.
I got you. First off, you finally admitted for the first time the net carbon fetish is.
I didn't admit it. I've been pretty clear on this whole frame, but I'm not naive about it. But also, by the way, I don't know what more evidence you guys need of Mother Nature's fury than we've had in the last year, but that's another conversation.
Well, for another day.
Yeah, we'll leave the climate change stuff to another day.
Right,
California, the state that almost burned down. I mean, kind of extraordinary. And people are saying his strategy here is to say, look, we can't, the right have got the media, they've got this podcasting thing sewn up, it is influential. We can't just gripe about it. We've got to engage with them. Some say he's trying to present himself as a centrist and healer, and in 2028 he'll be the candidate that will be able to straddle this boundary. But there are a lot of his supporters and a lot of people in California who do not like at all the ground he appears to be seeding here.
And remarkably, speaking of podcasters, Donald Trump, the US president, has made a podcast or two I see at the FBI.
Yep, the Dan Bongino show, and he's an ex-cop, now a pocket, making millions off this. Here is how the show is introduced.
Get ready to hear the truth about America.
They're arguing about things and debating how quickly they can deconstruct the greatest country in the history of mankind and all of the ideas and norms that have gotten us here.
On a show that's not immune to the facts, with your host, Dan Bongino.
All right, welcome to the Dan Bongino Show.
Yep, so that's a guy taking over the second position in the FBI, but he's got to give up that lucrative podcast to do the job, and he's really not handling it so well.
Yeah, interestingly, he has been advertising VPNs on his podcast to stop the government spying on you.
That's right. Yeah, so that is why that absolutely points out the conflict of interest that existed. But I listened to his final podcast episode. He's not handling it well. He was sniffling. He was upset. He was saying, I will see you on the other side, guys. We've built this thing together. And it's sounding, it's probably just an act, but he was sobbing like a small child. And that's the guy now who's going to be running high-grade investigations at the FBI. I'd be worried.